Ethan Voss had been in bad situations before, smuggling rare minerals past corporate warlords, getting stranded in an uncharted nebula, barely surviving a pirate ambush. But none of those compared to the absolute disaster unfolding before him now. The Varani High Court was silent as Queen Zyratel, ruler of the Varani Empire, regarded him with a gaze colder than deep space vacuum. She was beautiful, in a terrifying way, towering, statuesque, her pale silver skin adorned with intricate war tattoos, her piercing golden eyes, once indifferent to his existence, now gleamed with unsettling amusement. "Human," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Do you understand what you have done?" Ethan swallowed hard, still tasting the burning sweet nectar he'd just downed moments ago. The golden goblet trembled in his hand as realization dawned. "What?" he croaked. The high priest stepped forward, his gnarled hands clasped. "By partaking in the chalice of union, you have sealed a sacred bond of matrimony with the Varani monarch." Ethan's brain stalled. He blinked once, twice. "I did what?" A murmur rippled through the court. Some of the armored Varani warriors looked amused. Others looked outright furious. Queen Zyratel merely tilted her head, as if observing a particularly entertaining insect. Ethan shot a panicked glance at his alien contact, Rylokar, who hadn't warned him about this. The little amphibian-like merchant avoided eye contact. "Wait, wait, wait." Ethan took a step back. "This is a misunderstanding. I didn't—" Zyratel's hand shot up, silencing him. "The contract is sacred. There is no misunderstanding." Ethan's mouth went dry. "Can I, decline?" The high priest's expression turned stone cold. To break the contract would bring dishonor upon the queen. The penalty for dishonor is death. Fantastic. Ethan had accidentally married an alien warlord. And worse, he had no way out. Ethan Voss had been in impossible situations before. He'd faced bounty hunters, corporate enforcers, and even a malfunctioning FTL drive that nearly turned him into stardust. But nothing, compared to being trapped in an alien palace, married to a warlord queen, with no escape in sight. He sat stiffly on an ornate platform inside the royal skyship, a massive vessel shaped like a golden crescent, floating high above the jungles of Varana Prime. Around him, guards in shimmering black armor stood at attention, their spears humming with contained energy. Queen Zyratel sat across from him, relaxed, as if she hadn't just ruined his entire life. "I can see the terror in your eyes, human," she mused, resting her chin on her fist. "Is it the height that unsettles you? Or the weight of your new responsibility?" Ethan exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. "This is insane. You don't actually expect me to stay married to you, do you?" A smirk tugged at the corner of Zyratel's lips. "You speak as if you have a choice." His pulse spiked. He could still hear the high priest's words from the ceremony. Breaking the contract is dishonor. Dishonor is death. Sure, he'd been in tight spots before, but this was a cage with golden bars. The skyship rumbled as it descended toward the palace. A sprawling fortress carved into the side of a mountain, overlooking a sea of bioluminescent trees. The architecture was equal parts elegance and intimidation, a monument to power. Ethan barely had time to take in the sight before the ship landed, and the guards marched him inside. The royal palace, a prison in disguise. Ethan was ushered through cavernous halls lined with obsidian statues of past rulers, each one looking more bloodthirsty than the last. The air smelled of incense and some strange spice that made his nose tingle. They finally reached an enormous chamber overlooking the city below. The walls pulsed faintly, as if the entire palace was alive. "This will be your residence," Zyratel announced, gesturing to the luxurious room. Ethan eyed the silk-draped bed, the massive golden windows, and the floating holograms displaying news from the Empire. It was nicer than any place he'd ever lived in, which only made it worse. "A gilded cage," he muttered. Zyratel turned to him with a knowing smirk. "A cage, perhaps, but gilded? No, this is a throne." Ethan scoffed. "You can't seriously think I'm just going to play along with this?" Zyratel stepped closer, her golden eyes gleaming. You are my consort now, Ethan Voss. You have power beyond what any human has ever held. The moment you embrace this, you will cease to be a prisoner, right? And if I don't, Zyratel's smirk faded. Then you will be a very short-lived one. Ethan's jaw clenched. Great. So much for negotiations. Escape isn't an option. Ethan spent the next few hours testing every possible exit. The balcony? Sealed by an energy field. The door? Guarded by 2 8-foot-tall warriors who looked like they ate plasma grenades for breakfast. The ventilation shafts? Too small. He flopped onto the absurdly soft bed, groaning. This is worse than prison. A sharp knock interrupted his misery. A young Varani attendant entered, carrying a tray of food, some kind of roasted meat, along with a glowing purple fruit. Ethan sat up. What's this? Your first meal as royal consort, the attendant said, bowing deeply. The queen expects you to be at her side during tomorrow's High Council meeting. Ethan perked up. A meeting? That meant movement, distraction, maybe even an opening to escape. The attendant turned to leave, but Ethan called after him. Wait, what happens if I don't show up? The Varani hesitated before answering. It would deeply insult the queen. Ethan narrowed his eyes. And what happens when someone insults the queen? A long silence. Then, quietly, they are dealt with. Fantastic. Ethan slumped back onto the bed. Not only was he stuck, but now he had to play house with an alien warlord just to stay alive. A court full of enemies. The next morning, Ethan was dressed in formal Varani robes. A long, flowing garment with a metallic sheen that, admittedly, made him look pretty damn impressive. The servants tied an elaborate sash around his waist before guiding him to the High Council chamber. The room was massive, with towering pillars and a ceiling that displayed a holographic map of the empire. Zyratel sat on her throne, her expression unreadable. As Ethan took his seat beside her, he felt every eye in the room turn toward him, some filled with curiosity, others with outright hatred. A tall Varani noble with deep scars across his face stepped forward. My queen, he said, barely sparing Ethan a glance. You bring an outsider into this sacred hall? He is my consort, Zyratel replied coolly. His presence here is law. The noble's lips curled. Law? He is a human. A weak, dishonorable species. Ethan exhaled slowly. He'd been called worse, but something in the noble's tone made his blood boil. Zyratel's golden eyes flickered with amusement. Weak? She glanced at Ethan. Tell me, human, how would you respond to such an insult? Ethan hesitated. Every instinct told him to stay quiet. But then he saw the way the court watched him, waiting for him to fail. He grinned. I'd say he's got a lot of words for someone who looks like they lost a fight to a malfunctioning toaster. The chamber fell silent. For a moment no one moved. Then laughter. Not from the noble. From Zyratel. She smirked. Perhaps my consort is not as weak as you think. The noble glared daggers at Ethan. We shall see. As the meeting continued, Ethan had only one thought running through his head. He'd just made his first enemy. And if he didn't figure out a way to escape soon, it wouldn't be his last. Ethan Voss had been in more battles than he cared to count, but nothing prepared him for the political minefield he found himself navigating in the heart of the Varani Empire. As he sat beside Queen Zyratel in the High Council chamber, the atmosphere was thick with tension. He could feel the eyes of the Varani nobles on him. Some were curious, others hostile. But what he felt most acutely was the weight of the situation. There was no backing out now. He was bound to this alien queen by a marriage contract that no one, not even Zyratel herself, seemed ready to break. And if he didn't start playing the game, he'd be crushed under its weight. The council meeting dragged on. A few of the nobles spoke in favor of expanding Varani territory. Border disputes with neighboring systems were a constant source of friction. Some were eager to press their advantage over humanity, seeing Earth's relatively primitive state as an opportunity for conquest. Others, particularly the warrior class, wanted to keep the Empire's borders intact, content to battle among themselves for dominance. Ethan's mind wandered as he listened to the arguments unfold. He didn't care about the politics, he cared about getting out. The unexpected ally. The meeting was interrupted by a sharp cry from one of the younger nobles. A scout burst into the chamber, panting. "My queen, a fleet approaches the edge of the empire. Unknown origin. Unlike anything we've encountered before." Zyratel stood, her posture as rigid as the statues that adorned the palace. "Prepare the fleet for battle." The chamber erupted into chaos. Noble factions shouted across the room, some demanding military action, others wanting to send a diplomatic envoy. The room was divided, but Zyratel didn't wait for the squabbling to settle. Ethan saw his chance. While everyone was distracted, he shot a glance at Taliax, a quiet noble who had seemed unusually curious about him since the first meeting. Taliax was known for his tactical brilliance. Ethan had overheard Zyratel mention his name in a discussion with her closest advisors. Now, Taliax was one of the few nobles who hadn't participated in the shouting match. Instead, he stood off to the side, eyes locked onto Ethan. As soon as their gazes met, Taliax motioned for him to follow. Ethan hesitated. Trusting anyone here was a gamble. But this was his best shot. If he could get out now, there might be a chance for him to escape, or at the very least, find a way to leverage the situation to his advantage. He slipped away from the chaos, walking carefully across the room to join Taliax. "Not many humans survive long in the court. Consort," Taliax said, his voice low but clear. "But you have something the others do not, spirit. And I can see that you're not content being a trophy." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Spirits don't last long in places like this." Taliax smiled darkly. "True. But they also have the fire to burn down whatever tries to smother them. You want freedom. I can help you achieve that." Ethan's pulse quickened. "How?" Taliax leaned in, speaking quietly. "The queen has enemies. Powerful ones. Some of them even within her own court. If you want to leave, you'll need to act quickly. The rebel factions are planning something." Ethan's mind raced. A rebellion within the empire. This could be the opening he needed, but it was also dangerous. If he got tangled in the wrong side of this, he could be dead before the next sunrise. "What do you want from me?" Ethan asked cautiously. Taliax's smile didn't falter. "I'm not asking for much. The queen's power is fragile. If you disrupt her reign even a little, I can guarantee you the support of the other factions, the ones who want to see her dethroned." "Dethrone the queen?" Ethan asked incredulously. "You want me to side with your rebellion?" "No. I want you to disrupt the power structure. I want you to test the queen's strength. If she fails, you'll have the chance to leave. If she proves herself, then you stay by her side." Ethan took a moment to digest what Taliax was suggesting. Disrupt the queen, and in the chaos he might just have the chance to escape. But there was a bigger risk here. If the queen was stronger than he thought, Ethan would end up just another pawn in someone else's game. Still, he had no better option. "I'll play your game," Ethan said. "But if I end up dead, you'll answer for it." Taliax chuckled. "Fair enough. But remember, you'll have to make your own moves. I'm merely giving you the opportunity. A dangerous game." The days that followed were filled with political maneuvering. The fleet that had been spotted near the borders was a non-issue, just a fishing vessel that had accidentally strayed into Varani territory. But the real danger came from within. As the days wore on, Ethan learned that there were factions within the Varani court who viewed Zyratel as a weak queen, someone who had been overly indulgent with the human consort. They whispered that the human marriage was a political move to appease a growing human presence in the galaxy, and it undermined the strength of the empire. Ethan's job, it seemed, was to become the catalyst for unrest. The opportunity came when he was summoned to a private dinner with Zyratel. The queen, usually stoic and businesslike, had loosened her demeanor, her eyes reflecting something new, a curiosity toward Ethan. "Ethan," she said, her voice quieter than usual, "I am beginning to think you have more influence over my court than I imagined." Ethan took a breath, his heart pounding. "That's not a good thing, is it?" Zyratel smiled faintly. It's not a good thing when it threatens my power. Ethan leaned forward, aware that this conversation could change everything. Then maybe you should prove them wrong, Your Majesty. Her gaze hardened, and she stood, her posture regal. I will. And if you believe in me, you will stand by me when the time comes. Ethan nodded slowly. Of course. But deep down, he knew something that Xyratel didn't. The time was coming soon. And when it did, the choice he would make could either save him or destroy him. Ethan Voss had learned one thing in the past few days. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not in this court. Not in this empire. The game being played around him was as deadly as it was intricate, and the longer he stayed in the palace, the more dangerous his position became. He was no longer just the consort of Queen Xyratel. He was a pawn in a political game where every move counted. But it wasn't just about survival anymore. Ethan was starting to realize that the key to his freedom was no longer a simple escape. It was about changing the balance of power. Whispers of a coup. The night after their dinner, Ethan was summoned again, but this time by a different face. It was Taliax who appeared outside his chambers, his expression hard and businesslike. I have something to show you, Taliax said quietly, his voice barely audible over the noise of the distant city. Ethan followed the noble down a shadowy hallway, past the ornate statues and glowing murals that adorned the walls. The palace was vast, and the more he wandered through it, the more Ethan felt like he was moving through a labyrinth, each step taking him deeper into the heart of an empire that could crush him without a second thought. Finally, Taliax led him into a hidden room beneath the palace. The space was dark and cool, with only a flickering light from a holographic map of the Varani Empire. Several other figures stood around the map, all of them nobles, their identities hidden behind dark robes and masks. These are the leaders of the factions who oppose Xyratel's reign, Taliax explained. And they want you to help us take her down. Ethan stiffened. What does that mean for me? Taliax didn't hesitate. It means we'll make you a hero of the Varani people. You'll lead the charge against a queen who's become too weak to hold her throne. Ethan didn't reply immediately. The words were tempting, but he knew better than to jump headfirst into this. The promises of power were alluring, but who exactly were these people? What if they weren't any better than Xyratel? Before he could voice his concerns, one of the masked figures stepped forward. You'll be well compensated, the figure said, his voice rich with authority. Xyratel's reign has already caused enough unrest. If we act now, we can restore balance to the empire. Ethan scanned their faces, trying to read any hint of their true motives. But all he saw were masked eyes and shadows, like they were all hiding something. What happens after Xyratel falls? Ethan asked carefully. The figure paused. We'll restore the ancient order, one that values strength, honor, and the unity of the Varani people. You will have a place in that world, human. A place where you'll never again be forced to be someone's pawn. Ethan thought about that for a moment. The offer was tempting, more freedom, more control. But something about it felt off. If these people were truly the answer to his problems, why did they need him, a human, to do their dirty work? I'll think about it, he said finally, not fully committing but not rejecting them either. The figure inclined his head. Do so quickly. The time for decisions is running out. The Queen's warning. The next day, Xyratel summoned Ethan to her private quarters. Her tone was even, but there was a cold edge to her voice when she spoke. I know you've been meeting with Taliax, she said, her gaze piercing. Ethan's heart skipped. He hadn't realized just how much she had been watching him. Don't lie to me, she cut him off, stepping closer. I know everything that happens in my court. Every whisper, every plan. Her eyes narrowed. And I know you're not just here because you love me. Ethan swallowed hard. This was it. The moment he'd been dreading. I'm not here because I love you, no. But I'm not plotting against you either. Xyratel's lips twitched upward, but there was no humor in the smile. You're playing a dangerous game, Ethan. Taliax, the rebels, they'll use you. They always use humans like you. Ethan raised an eyebrow. And what about you? What happens when you're done with me? Xyratel's expression darkened. Don't think for a second I can't replace you. I don't need you to hold my throne, Ethan. But I've allowed you to stay because you're an asset. Ethan met her gaze. An asset I can still choose to destroy. Then, her golden eyes flashed, but she didn't react. Instead, she simply smiled, the smile of someone who had seen every play before. We'll see about that, the moment of truth. Over the next few days, the tension in the palace reached a boiling point. Whispers of a coup were no longer confined to dark corners. The rebel factions were mobilizing, and Ethan could sense the air growing thick with danger. He had no doubt now, Xyrotal's reign was teetering on the edge of collapse, and his role in the coming chaos would determine everything. Taliax had made his offer, and it was too enticing to ignore, but Xyrotal's warning echoed in his mind. He was walking a razor-thin line between betraying a queen who had spared his life and securing his own freedom through whatever means necessary. But there was one thing Ethan knew for certain. If he was going to break free, he couldn't just play by the rebels' rules. He had to make his own move. That opportunity came when Xyrotal hosted an exclusive gala for the highest-ranking members of her court. The palace was alive with the sound of music, and guests roamed the grand halls, their laughter echoing beneath towering statues of long-dead warriors. But beneath the extravagance, the tension was palpable. Ethan could feel it in the way the nobles whispered when they thought he wasn't listening, the way their eyes lingered on him like he was a potential threat. He stood at the edge of the room, observing the scene, when he saw the perfect opening. Xyrotal was occupied, conversing with a small group of advisors, her back to the crowd. Nearby, one of the rebel leaders, Jorith, a hulking Varani warrior with a scarred face, was speaking with several nobles about the strategic deployment of forces. If Ethan was going to make his move, now was the time. He took a deep breath. Ethan Voss had learned that in the Varani Empire, there was no such thing as a small choice. Every decision carried weight. Every action reverberated through the intricate web of politics and power. As he stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, staring at the back of Queen Xyrotal as she mingled with her advisors, he realized that the time for hesitation had passed. His next move would determine his fate, and possibly the fate of an entire empire. The rebels' proposition. Ethan's pulse quickened as he scanned the room, his eyes locking onto Jorith, the hulking rebel leader who had been one of the prime orchestrators behind the coup. Jorith had been careful, never revealing too much to Ethan, but he had made one thing clear. The human consort was a key asset in the coming rebellion. But the more Ethan had seen of Jorith, the more he realized something that made his blood run cold. Jorith was no savior. He was a warlord, ruthless and ambitious, and if he took control, the empire would simply shift from one oppressive regime to another. Still, if Ethan played his cards right, he could turn the rebellion to his advantage. He could destroy both Xyrotal's fragile reign and Jorith's bid for power. But he needed to act fast, before either side realized he wasn't playing by their rules. With determination setting his jaw, Ethan moved toward Jorith, sidestepping a group of laughing nobles and ducking beneath the low-hanging tapestries that decorated the hallway. His path was direct, and his movements were purposeful. As he neared Jorith, the warrior turned, his red eyes narrowing as he saw the human approaching. "You came," Jorith rumbled, his voice a low growl that carried the weight of authority. "I'm here," Ethan replied coolly, "but not because I trust you." Jorith chuckled, though there was no warmth in the sound. "Then why come at all, human?" Ethan leaned in slightly, his eyes glinting with a cold intensity. "Because I'm not in this for your revolution. I have my own plans." Jorith's expression shifted, amusement crossing his features as if he were considering a particularly interesting puzzle. "I thought you were more than just a pawn, but you haven't impressed me yet." "What kind of plans could a lowly human have that interest me?" "I'll destroy Xyrotal for you," Ethan said flatly. "But I won't do it your way." The rebel leader raised an eyebrow. "And how do you propose to destroy her?" Ethan's gaze flickered toward the towering windows, where the distant stars glinted in the sky like diamonds. "You're so caught up in your revolution that you're blind to the real problem here. Xyrotal's weakness isn't just her politics. It's her loyalty. The court is splintered, Jorith." Even if you overthrow her, the nobles will tear each other apart for the throne. You want to rule the empire? Then you need to control all of it, not just the military factions. Jorith studied him for a long moment, the muscles in his jaw twitching as he processed the human's words. And you think you can unite them? A single human can unite the Varani court. Ethan's lips curled into a smile, but it was sharp, like a predator's grin. No, I'm going to destroy it all. The Queen's last gamble. Back in the royal palace, Queen Xyratal was not as oblivious as Ethan had hoped. The nobles had grown restless in the wake of her failed attempts to quell dissent. Her alliance with humanity had made her a target for more than just the rebel factions. It had created a rift within her own people, those who had once followed her as the rightful heir to the throne. Xyratal had sensed the shift in the air long before Ethan's interactions with the rebels, and she wasn't about to wait for them to strike first. She had made plans of her own. In the secluded depths of the palace, Xyratal convened a secret meeting with her most trusted allies. Standing tall in her black and gold armor, her voice was low but commanding as she addressed the room. The humans think they can play us. Ethan thinks he can outwit me, but he doesn't know the truth. Her advisor, a sharp-eyed Varani named Igor, spoke up. What truth do you speak of, my queen? The truth that if I lose my throne, the entire empire will fall into chaos. Her golden eyes glittered. There is no power vacuum more dangerous than the one that follows my downfall. The rebellion will never be satisfied with mere conquest. They will tear the empire apart. I will not let that happen. Her voice softened but remained resolute. I will prove my strength, even if I must destroy everything in my path. The storm unleashed. The night of the grand gala arrived, and with it, the pressure had reached a breaking point. The empire teetered on the edge of civil war. Rebels and loyalists alike were preparing for open conflict. But no one was prepared for what happened next. Ethan had gathered his allies, those few who were willing to follow him, people who saw the truth in his vision. The night was young, and the halls of the palace were bathed in gold and crimson light. Music echoed off the walls, and laughter filled the air. It was as though nothing was wrong. Yet, beneath the surface, the chaos was already simmering. As Ethan stood by one of the grand columns, watching the nobles play their game, he received a covert signal from Taliax. The time had come. Without a word, he slipped into the shadows, moving through the labyrinthine hallways to where Jorith had promised to meet him. The rebel leader was already there, his eyes cold and calculating. The hour is upon us. The Queen's forces are unprepared for a direct assault. We will sweep through the palace and take control of the capital. Ethan nodded, though his mind was already racing. This wasn't the plan. He wasn't going to let Jorith lead the charge. Not like this. Just as Jorith raised his hand to give the order to advance, Ethan acted. He threw a small device at the floor, and with a loud crack, the room was plunged into darkness. In the confusion, Ethan drew his weapon, a silent stun gun. Something to disable, not kill. The light flickered back on, but by then, several of Jorith's men had already collapsed, their bodies twitching in the aftermath of the shock. What are you doing? Jorith roared, spinning around. I told you, Ethan said, his voice unwavering. I'm not here to play your revolution. With a snap, Ethan activated the self-destruct protocol on the Empire's security grid. In a matter of moments, the palace defenses were overridden, and chaos spread. The rebels were thrown into disarray as Xyratal's loyal forces advanced from the shadows, turning the tide of battle. The chaos in the palace unfolded like a storm. One moment, everything had seemed poised on the brink of war. The next, everything was in freefall. Rebels, loyalists, and soldiers alike scrambled through the darkened halls of the palace, their movements clumsy and desperate in the disarray. The blaring alarms were drowned out by the sounds of combat, blasters firing, screams echoing off marble walls, and the unmistakable clank of armored boots. But amid the turmoil, Ethan Voss moved like a shadow, his every step calculated. His heart pounded, but his mind was clear. He'd been waiting for this moment, the final confrontation, the moment when everything would change. The final gamble. Ethan's plan had been simple. Create chaos, ensure both sides were equally disoriented, and then exploit the confusion to put the final nail in the coffin of both Xyratal's rule and Joratha's rebellion. The palace's security grid had been his key. By overriding the system, he had triggered a cascade of failures, knocking out communications, surveillance, and defense systems. The Varani military, usually so precise and efficient, was left blind. Both Joratha's forces and the Queen's guards were caught off guard, unsure of who to trust. But Ethan hadn't just wanted to defeat one faction. He wanted to shatter the very foundation of the Empire's hierarchical structure. He needed to make sure that no one would be able to claim control after the dust settled. He turned a corner, finding himself in front of the royal chambers. Xyratal had been his queen, his captor, and now she was the symbol of everything he had come to despise about this brutal, caste-driven empire. He had no loyalty left to her, but neither did he feel any allegiance to the rebels. Ethan had learned something in the past few weeks. There were no good guys here. The only way to change the future was to burn the old system to the ground. The door to Xyratal's chambers was ajar. Inside, he saw her, standing by the large observation window, staring out over the burning city. Her golden eyes, usually filled with cold command, now seemed distant, lost in thought. She didn't notice him at first. "You've come," she said finally, her voice soft, almost sad. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He was too busy surveying the room, every corner, every potential trap. He didn't trust her anymore, and he had no illusions about her intentions. "I should have known," Xyratal continued, turning to face him. Her posture was regal, but her face was tense. "You've been playing both sides, haven't you? The rebels think you're helping them, but you're not. You never were." "I never wanted to play your game," Ethan replied, stepping further into the room. "I just wanted to survive. But now I realize there's more at stake. It's not about you or Jorath, it's about what comes after. This empire needs to fall." Xyratal's lips twitched into a bitter smile. "You think you can destroy everything I've built? Everything the Varani have fought for?" Ethan's gaze hardened. "No, I'm not going to destroy it. I'm going to rebuild it. The old ways have to die. Both your rule and Joratha's will only lead to more bloodshed, more division. The Varani need a new order, one that doesn't rely on thrones or armies." Xyratal's eyes flickered with something. Anger? Regret? It was hard to tell, but Ethan didn't wait to find out. "You were never meant to rule like this," he said coldly. "And neither was Jorath. This empire, these people, they deserve something better than the lies and wars you've built." Xyratal's gaze narrowed. "You still don't understand, do you? The galaxy is not kind. Power is what keeps us alive. And I will fight for it until my last breath." Ethan stepped forward, his hand gripping the hilt of the weapon at his side. "Then fight. But I'm not here to let you win." The confrontation, the standoff was electric. Xyratal's regal composure clashed with the raw intensity of Ethan's resolve. For a moment, neither of them moved, as though the entire empire's fate hung in the balance. And in many ways it did. With a swift motion, Xyratal reached for her blade. A curved, obsidian weapon that shimmered in the dim light of the room. She swung it in a graceful arc, but Ethan was faster. He sidestepped the attack and, with a quick movement, incapacitated her, his stun gun firing at her side. The queen crumpled to the floor, her weapon clattering from her hand. Ethan stood over her, breathing hard, his heart pounding in his chest. "This isn't about you, Xyratal. This is about freedom." Xyratal's voice was hoarse, but there was a hint of defiance left in her tone. "You think you can change anything? You're just one human, no more than a tool for the rebellion. You will fall just like the rest of us." Ethan's gaze softened for a fleeting moment. "Maybe, but I'm not going to be anyone's tool anymore." The collapse of the empire. As the queen lay unconscious on the floor, Ethan turned and exited the room. The rebellion raged on, but the palace was already falling into disarray. The rebels had lost their momentum, and Xyratal's loyalists, though temporarily thrown off guard, were regrouping. The chaos would only increase as word spread of the Queen's fall. But Ethan's actions were far from over. He moved quickly, making his way to the central control room. The palace's core was a nerve center of both power and data, a system that kept the entire empire running. With calculated precision, he initiated a sequence that would completely disrupt the imperial government's ability to function. The Varani Empire would not just collapse. It would be rendered obsolete, its systems and structures erased. The central system powered down, and the entire palace fell silent for a brief moment, the weight of the decision settling over Ethan like a suffocating fog. But then, as the rumblings of the final collapse echoed in the distance, he felt the first shred of freedom. A new dawn. In the aftermath, the empire was no more. The palace, once the symbol of power, was now a crumbled ruin. No one, neither rebels nor loyalists, was left to claim it. There were no victors, only survivors. Ethan Voss stood at the edge of what had once been a grand balcony, watching the sun rise over the broken city. His hands were stained with blood, both from battle and betrayal, but in his heart, there was a flicker of hope. The empire had burned, but now, from the ashes, there could be something new. It was not going to be easy. Rebuilding from the chaos would take time, and not everyone would agree on what the future should look like. But for the first time, Ethan Voss felt like he had a hand in shaping that future. One where humans were no longer seen as pawns, and where power no longer came from thrones or wars, but from the unity of the people.